Chapter 4, A Day in the Life of the Addict. A day in my life as an addict started with regrets. Not over what I had done the previous night. Often I didn't remember, or only heard about it later from friends who were there, but regret over the simple fact that I was still alive. Do you have any idea what a black, empty, desperate feeling that is? To wake up and say to yourself, "Damn, I didn't succeed in killing myself last night. How much stuff do I have to take?" If you're an addict, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, well, be glad you don't. At that point, as my room blurred into focus, I would look to see if there was a drink next to me, maybe half a glass of vodka from the night before, so that I could have a little eye-opener. I'd also see if there was a girl sharing my bed. Quite often, and I don't say this to brag, there was. Needless to say, she wouldn't be the kind you wanted to bring home to your parents, which is one reason that by age 19, I was out of my parents' house. From June 1987 to March 1991, I lived in a one-room apartment in my hometown. It was located on the top floor of the building my father owned, in which he operated his business. Yes, this is the same father who kicked me out of his house, yet he still felt guilty enough to allow his deadbeat son to live rent-free in a flat that was transformed into the 20th century Midwest equivalent of a Shanghai opium den. It was a one-bedroom apartment, adequate for my needs, and my needs at that point were to basically get as messed up as I could, as often as I could, and in a wonderful twist of irony, it looked over the local police station. They made a few visits to this apartment, but if they knew everything that had been going on there under their noses, they would have shut me down faster than a crack house next to an elementary school. I had been caught up in the throes of addiction while living in my parents' house as a high school student, and I would then move the madness to a new location in Florida, where I already spent one miserable Christmas, and finally spent a one-year coked-up culmination of my life as an addict at my grandmother's house leading up to my sobriety. But for that 4.5-year period between the ages of 21 and 24, this little dump in downtown Sylvania was my base of operations for the ongoing quest to kill myself, a process that unfolded slowly, day by day, and came close to fruition. Now it was time for my morning puke. If there was some blood in it, that probably meant I had a particularly good night, or maybe that I'd been punched by somebody, maybe even a friend, when we wrestled over the last line of coke or something. Sometimes I'd walk into the bathroom to find out that somebody else already beat me to it, vomit on my bathroom floor or in my sink from the night before. Maybe mine, maybe not. How's that for a nice way to start the day? Occasionally it was even worse. One time I woke up covered in blood. The night before, I later learned, I had punched out a glass window and severely cut my hand and arm. I was already too wasted to do anything about it, so I just had another 10 drinks or so and passed out until morning. It was my boss who discovered me. I was working at that time for an ice delivery place because, yet again, I had not shown up for work that morning. He came to the apartment and found a trail of blood leading from the building entrance all the way down the hall into my bedroom. He kicked open the door, where he found a blood-soaked bed and a body lying there with a sheet over its head. That would be me. He thought I was dead, but unfortunately, I wasn't. Once he roused me and helped me clean off, how did I thank him? By asking him for the day off, of course. This had little to do with resting and healing my damaged arm. I wanted to stay home from work so I could just lie around my apartment and get trashed all over again. My ploy didn't work for that day. He dragged my butt and bandaged up arm to work, and I had to drive around with him all day, feeling like crud and listening to him lecture me about how screwed up my life was. Most of the time, I was unemployed, so it didn't matter when I woke up. After the puke, I'd clean myself up. Food wasn't a high priority. If I had been really drunk, I was usually too hungover to eat. If I had been all coked up, I was usually too wired to stomach a morsel. Anyway, the refrigerator was almost empty of everything except liquids, mostly beer. This was something that must have affected me. Nowadays, I always have a full fridge. I guess it's one way of reminding myself how far I've come, from a life that was empty and barren and as cold as my old frigid air. So the order of the day was basically wake up, puke, clean up self and apartment, get on phone and try and score stuff to start the party all over again. With the booze, it was easier, of course. The hardest part was driving myself to the liquor store because my head would be pounding from the night before. Many times I would scribble down a note and hand it to my main man, Larry, and have him take it over to the local carryout. They knew me there. I was what you'd call a high-volume customer. Because this was always first priority, all my money from work and dealing went towards drugs and alcohol, and I had good credit with both the carryout and Clips, our local liquor store. So I'd write down my shopping list. 2 cases of beer, 5 to 10 bottles of wine, fifths of rum, vodka, Jack Daniels, and Jim Beam. Larry, the delivery boy, would bring it back. I'd give him a little something, usually a thanks, and an invitation to share a drink, and then let's party. Sometimes I'd run up a load of debt on my credit cards. I can remember around Christmas one year going to a liquor store and buying $500 or $600 worth of booze and watching them bring it out on dollies and noticing the clerk's face. They were looking at all this stuff and looking at me and then looking at each other as if to say, "Damn, this is a lot of booze. This guy must be a serious party animal." I kind of liked that. It was a way of reasserting the fact that I was the leading drunk in Sylvania. Numero uno, baby. It's a personality trait I still have. I always want to be the best at what I'm doing. At that time, I wanted to be the best loser around, and I was obviously doing a pretty damn good job of it. While I was waiting for my friends to show up with the booze, or maybe some drugs they'd scored, I'd usually pull out a bottle of Southern Comfort, my preferred morning drink. I had to have something in the morning, otherwise I couldn't function. If I was working, this was happening at 7 a.m. If not, it was about 11. Either way, I'd be looking forward to my afternoon drink. Afternoon, I'd switch to rum and Coke, or Jack Daniels and Coke. I always made sure it was Diet Coke. I didn't want the extra calories. Nice, huh? I was barely 21 and already working on a good case of cirrhosis of the liver and stomach ulcerations. But hey, I was counting those calories. Same thing with vodka. If I was having that, I'd mix it with OJ to make sure I was getting my vitamin C. A lot of good that was going to do me while I was burning my guts out and frying my brain on a daily basis. It's interesting, though. As much of a total degenerate as I was, I had been an athlete in high school, and I still tried to keep myself looking like one. As with everything else in my life, it was a mirage, a cover-up. I kept myself clean until later at night when I was out of my mind. Always wore stylish clothes, got my hair cut, and used to lift weights regularly so that I'd look good for the girlies. There were even periods, usually after some really bad experience, where I'd tone down the drug and drink, eat right, work out, and swear to everyone around me that I was cleaning up my act. Never lasted for more than a couple of days. If I wasn't working, I was usually pretty messed up again by noon. If not, it would just take a little longer. Say until 4 or 5 p.m. when I got off. Either way, before the sun was down, I'd have down a fifth of booze or close to it and have some drugs in me as well. If I could, I'd stay home. I knew that once I really get rolling, it was too much of a hassle for me to go out. I knew that I'd probably pass out. Better to do that on my couch than in some parking lot. It was a lot easier and cheaper to stay home and let the drugs, the booze, and the party come to me, which it did as the day wore on. Once in a while, I'd sit at a local bar. I remember one time, Larry and one of his buddies asked me to meet them for lunch. I arrived and had the bartender line them up. 2 double shots of Southern Comfort, double vodka and cranberry juice, and a glass of water. No food. Larry's friend looked at my little assembly line of self-destruction and said to Larry in a stage whisper that I could hear, "Are you kidding me? This is his lunch?" Whether I was working at some stupid menial job or not, by the afternoon I had to get to work. My real work. Lying. Lying is a big part of the addict's life. Don't look disgusted. In this sense, we're in good company. Lawyers, politicians, corporate spokespeople all lie too. The fact that I spent hours a day lying is probably one of the few things I had in common with your typical American corporate drone. Sometimes, of course, they have to lie for a good reason. An addict's lying involves trying to convince everybody that he doesn't have what they know he'll do anything to get: drugs. This was the 1980s, and our big drug was Coke. Coke, of course, was incredibly expensive, which is one reason that the cheaper smoked form, called crack, really caught on, with devastating effects in poor neighborhoods. I smoked crack many times, but generally, my preferred mode of getting Coke into my body was through the nose. Indeed, I had progressed my way up the middle-class white man's Coke hierarchy. I started by snorting a couple of lines in high school. Typical of an addict like me, I was soon buying what we called sixteenths, a 1/16 of an ounce. Then 8 balls, an eighth of an ounce, or 3 grams, which in those days cost about $250. By the time I moved into the apartment, at age 21, my standard Coke denomination was a 1/4 ounce. Anything less was like, why bother? A 1/4 ounce of Coke cost me about $700, and it would last me a weekend. Not exactly your most economical form of recreation. Given my need and its cost, I wanted as much Coke for myself as possible. So a large part of the lying was trying to convince my various girlfriends and other male and female druggie friends that I didn't have any. Hey man, I'd say when they'd call or show up, I did it all last night. Then I'd reach into the back of my desk drawer, pull out the gram I had saved, roll out my special snorter, and give it a few toots. Oh yes, I had all the accoutrements for successful Coke use. I used a gold razor blade to cut up the Coke. In high school, I'd use the barrel of a Bic pen to snort my lines. Now that I was a cool adult, I used more elaborate methods. For a while, I did the cliché of a rolled-up $100 bill. Eventually, I used a glass cocaine snorter, designed for the connoisseur addict like me. It had a U-shaped piece you could stick into each nostril and hoover up every grain. The centerpiece of my little Coke den was a 16 by 20-inch glass frame picture of Motley Crue. It had a flat surface, perfect for cutting up the Coke, with a 1/2-inch indentation separating the glass from the wooden frame, perfect for catching every stray, expensive flake. I never used a mirror to cut it up. I didn't want to look at my face while I was snorting. So I'd sit there by myself and crank up the stereo. When I was all excited and wired up, and maybe had a few friends around, it was hair metal all the way through the early evening. Crue, AC/DC, Guns N' Roses, Poison. Later when the crowd left, it was moodier stuff. James Taylor, Lionel Richie, Cat Stevens, and my favorite melancholy ballad, Angie by the Stones. These were sad and lonely times. I liked being around people when I was stoned, but I didn't want to share any of the stuff I was getting stoned with. My lies about not having any Coke kept people away, except for the women I needed as sexual partners. Such a dilemma for the poor addict. The dishonesty was also a big part of my second job, small-time drug dealer. I got my drugs from 3 mid-level suppliers. Matt, a good friend of mine, Barry, a friend of the girl who used to cut my hair, and Ferd, my former hockey teammate, who had gone to become a real Ohio narco king. Ferd was probably moving close to 100 pounds of pot and a 1/2 kilo of Coke every week. They'd usually drop the stuff off with me, although occasionally I met Matt in the parking lot of a department store to get the Coke, which made me nervous. I was always expecting it to go down like some movie or cop TV show, where the minute we exchange the drugs and money, you hear somebody yell, "Let's go!" Feet clomping, and the next thing you know, I'm spread-eagled up against my car. Fortunately for me, that never happened. I only bought 8 balls from these guys, but I was a regular customer. So regular that Barry the dealer wanted to cut me off. I was like, "What? Cut me off? This is your job, dude." He said, "I don't want to see you kill yourself. You know you're in bad shape when your drug dealer is concerned about how much you're using." So I'd buy an 8 ball from one of my dealers, then I'd take 3/4 of it for myself and sell the rest as a full 8 ball. Buying drugs isn't like buying a new car. There aren't government or industry standards that have to be adhered to. I say it's an 8 ball. You don't think so? Fine, don't buy it. Lots of other people around here will. This is the middle of Ohio, not uptown Manhattan, pal. Your choices are limited. This was actually not true. You could drive 15 minutes to Toledo and score all you wanted. But that was a black neighborhood, and a lot of these middle American kids were too scared to do that. Not too scared to do drugs, however. The fun part of dealing, besides the fact that I had all this Coke for my head, was that I could play Scarface and sit around with a load of Coke piled up on my living room table. I'd build it up like a little snow mountain and watch some of my so-called friends watch me as I took big, deep snorts. They'd be licking their lips and I'd say, "Hey, you want some? You gotta buy some." One time, I told a group of deadbeats who had come by to score that I had to take a leak. I got up and left my white mountain on the table. It was a ruse. I peeked back around the corner of my living room and saw one of them pick up my rolled-up bill and try to take a quick snort. I rushed back in the room, ripped the bill out of his hand, and punched him in the mouth. I never hesitated with that stuff. Between hockey and addiction, I was probably in more fights than some professional boxers. Then I threw his ass out on the street. This sent a good message. Don't fuck with the coke dealer. I was pretty good at getting what I wanted. I once convinced some local dirtbag to rob the house of a guy I grew up with in order to get the drug money. He broke in, stole a video cassette recorder, came back to me lugging the thing. The plan was to hock it. A VCR, for Christ's sakes. How much did we really think we were going to get for it? And then spend the money on drugs. I stuck it in my old hockey bag and gave it to a girl I knew for safekeeping. She called the cops. They came to my parents' house. I was there at the time, arrested me on the spot, and dragged me out in handcuffs. At the station, I was told that I was looking at 8 years for receiving stolen property. They offered me a deal. If I could give them, quote, information on the local drug scene, maybe they could reduce the sentence. What they were interested in, they said, was the purity of the cocaine circulating in the Toledo area. They wanted me to make a coke buy, something they seemed to realize I was very experienced at, and then bring them a sample. Now this was my idea of law and order. Sure, I said, I'm happy to do my duty as a citizen. So they gave me $200 and off I went to Point Place, a part of Toledo where you could buy any kind of drug you wanted. I bought a couple of grams from a street corner dealer and immediately went to test it myself. I did one line and couldn't stop. Within a few minutes, almost all of the coke I had purchased, with the cops' money, was gone. I drove back to Sylvania and walked into the police station high as a kite. I sat there as the detectives examined the remaining and rather minuscule sample I brought them. I tried to look serious, but inside I was grinning like the Cheshire Cat. Did the cops know I basically ripped them off? Did I use their money to score and get high? Did they care? I'm not sure, but it was sure fun to think I pulled one over on them. Not to mention the fact that the charges against me for receiving stolen property were dropped. By that point, I had moved to Granny's. Dad had finally had enough of what was going on in his apartment. I thought I had fooled him, but I hadn't. He just came up to the apartment and looked around. He checked the dumpster out back and see if it was full of liquor bottles, cans, and little clear plastic bags. He'd see me and know I was coked because the pupils of my eyes would be black and dilated. My little addict's nest came undone on March 6, 1991. He came up to the apartment and said, "You have two options. Either you're out on the street or in rehab. Either way, it's over here. I'm not going to watch you kill yourself in my apartment." I said I'll take rehab, but only after I finish this cocaine. I wanted the bad stuff to stop at this point. I really did, but I wasn't quite ready to give it up. So my dad sat there for 8 hours while I finished off an entire quarter ounce of coke. It was bizarre. There were moments when he'd cry, then he'd matter-of-factly discuss what he would do with the insurance money he'd collect when I finally overdosed and died. He said they'd probably donate it to a charity that fights substance abuse. After 8 hours, he took me to the local Sylvania Medical Center, Flower Hospital, which had a rehab unit. I spent 2 weeks there. It amounted to a 2-week break where I could eat well, sleep undisturbed, avoid people I owed money to, and listen to some interesting lectures. The minute I got out, however, it was back to business. Within 3 days of leaving rehab, I started drinking again. That night, I got a bunch of tranquilizers, took them at my friend's house, and ended up passing out in his living room with his parents sitting there. Next morning, I woke up on their floor, in my underwear. Something wasn't right. I realized that I had soiled myself. I took off my underwear, threw it in their backyard, put my pants back on, and started drinking again. When you pass out in someone's house, nearly naked and defecate on yourself, you've just about hit bottom, in my opinion. But I wasn't done yet. First, I needed a new place to stay. Whenever I was really scared, really in trouble, or really desperate for money or sympathy, I went down the road to Grandma's. Lillian Ward was and is a strong person, an absolutely critical person in my life. She knew the score about me and wasn't denying the fact that I was an addict, something that others, including my parents, were. I moved in there in early April 1991, and the debauchery continued. Many nights I remember puking in her toilet. She'd come in, stand behind me, and pat me on the back saying, "I know you're going to beat this someday." And I was lying there on her bathroom floor, my arms wrapped around the toilet seat saying, "I'm dying, Grandma. I'm not going to beat it. It's killing me." And she would insist that, yes, I would beat it. Eventually, Granny would be instrumental in my recovery. But before then, even her reassuring words couldn't bring me out of the dark spiral that my life was becoming. No doubt at this point my entire life was a bad day, but some were worse than others. One of the very worst was Thanksgiving Day 1991, when I put together 3 of the most strung-out days of my life. The day before Thanksgiving is a big drinking night for a lot of people, especially drunks like me. But this year, I had something really special in the works. You see, this weekend my grandma was out of town. I was going to mind the house while she was away, and I had a nice little Thanksgiving surprise all planned out. I was going to get really wasted, throw the mother of all parties, then go into her garage, close the door, get in the car, turn on the ignition, and kill myself. I remember going around town that morning. I even went to the gym. Guess I wanted to look buff for the corner, seeing a lot of familiar faces and thinking, this is the last time you're going to see these people. After my workout, it was straight to the liquor store, which opened at 10 a.m. that day. I bought 2 half-gallons of vodka and was hammered by 11. As usual, Larry, a good guy whose friendship I totally abused for my own selfish, addicted purposes, came by. But because this was my grandma's house and not my apartment, he stopped to take in the view. Her backyard faces 10 Mile Creek. The view from Grandma's back porch is almost idyllic. A lazy river surrounded by walnut, maple, and buckeye trees, and a dazzling array of flowers. Nice view, Larry said. Screw that, I remember telling him. I was planning to check out that day and no bullshit view was going to distract me. I was waiting for my drugs to arrive. I had about $300 in cash set out for a 1/4 ounce of coke. I'm still not sure what happened, and neither is Larry, but a group of our friends arrived. We were drinking. More people came and went. This was the middle of the afternoon, and at some point I realized my money was gone. No coke. In retrospect, that might have saved my life, because if I'd stayed awake, all coked up instead of passing out, I probably would have gone through with the plan. Some of what happened is a blur, but I do know that by evening, having continued to drink, I was talking about burning my grandma's house down, with all of us in it. I was obviously so drunk I'd forgotten about the original suicide plan. For dinner that night, I made a cocktail in the blender that my grandma used to serve me. Pineapples, strawberries, yogurt, and a banana, all blended up together. What today you'd call a smoothie, except the addict added a special ingredient, the one Grandma left out of her recipes, a 1/2 quart of vodka. By 9 p.m., so Larry later told me, I was passed out. I woke up the next morning, still drunk. I was naked in my bed, with one girl fully clothed lying next to me, and another, looking none too happy, standing there staring at us. The 2 girls started to fight. I reached out to try and pull both of them on top of me for a little 3-way sex, but I was too hammered and they were too angry. They stormed out of the room, and as I began to think about it, I realized that I had gotten too fucked up the night before to kill myself. Imagine that. I couldn't even pull that off, I was so wasted. What a loser. Well, I thought today's Thanksgiving. If I do it today, everybody in this town will be thanking me. The girls were gone, my $300 was gone, and I was still here. I was not happy. One answer for that, I called Clips, the liquor store, to see if they were open. When they answered, I was jumping up and down. So excited was I that they were open on Thanksgiving Day. In retrospect, I think they might have opened up just for me. I got ever-faithful Larry to drive me to Clips. We picked up more booze, stopping first at Sears, where I used my grandma's credit card to get a cash advance. By noon that day, I was out of my mind again, and alone, but still without any cocaine. The normal people had gone home for Thanksgiving. My parents were having Thanksgiving dinner at their house just a couple of miles away, but I wanted no part of it. So I just sat in my grandma's living room, mixing drink after drink. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I decided it was time to kill myself. I remember getting up to get into my grandma's car, but I must have chickened out at the last minute. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my girlfriend's bed at her parents' house. Some boyfriend I was. I had attempted to sleep with at least 2 other girls in the preceding 24 hours. Evidently, I'd driven the car out of my grandma's garage and over to Jenny's house, where I drove it up on the front lawn. I got out, left the car running, walked in the house in the middle of their dinner, and before saying a word, passed out on their floor. They all sat there over their Thanksgiving dinner, forks poised in midair, mouths open, so I'm told. Here I was now, waking up from my 3rd straight day of debauchery, and one more chance for a successful suicide. After tearfully dishonest apologies to my girlfriend and her mother for ruining their Thanksgiving dinner, it was back to my grandma's house. I arrived to find the front and garage doors wide open and music blaring. Another buddy, also named Todd, was sitting there. He told me he found the house like this the night before and decided he'd better stay and keep an eye on it. He told me that when he arrived, the Doors song The End was playing over and over on the CD. That was by design, I recalled as he told me the story. It was going to be the soundtrack of my suicide. But again, I'd fucked that up, just like everything else. Here I was, still alive. Oh well, let's party. Which we did. Finally, about 3 p.m., with me drunk out of my skull, my buddy Matt the dealer showed up with the 1/4 ounce of coke I'd been coveting since Wednesday. For the rest of the weekend, I did lines, puked, got laid a couple of times, once with Larry watching, but not with my girlfriend. She wanted no part of me for a while. At one point in the evening, I punched a girl. Kim was her name, and we had known each other for a while. I was sitting on the couch with Kim's buddy Chris, and I started fondling her. I did it right in front of Kim, and she didn't take kindly to my provocation. She picked up a beer bottle and threw it at me, hit me square in the face. I got up and clocked her right in the face. She had a black eye for months, something I'm definitely not proud of. At another point, a couple of hockey players showed up. They were both in college by then, a little younger than me, but they'd gone to Sylvania High School when I was the man, the goalie no one scored on. They remembered me as Todd, the best high school goalie in the state and the guy with pro potential. Now I was Todd, the worst drunk and drug addict in town, and the guy with no future. I remember looking up from my grandma's table as I did yet another line and catching one of them staring at me with a horrified expression on his face. Even in my haze and rage, I felt ashamed. By Sunday afternoon on that Thanksgiving weekend, I had consumed over 5 days, about 3 gallons of vodka, a case of beer, the better part of an ounce of pot, and a full 1/4 ounce of coke. About 6 p.m., I realized I had to pick up Granny at the airport. I sprang up on my wobbly legs, shooed all the drunks out, and started assessing the damage. There were empty bottles, booze stains, and grains of coke scattered on the rug. Those I sucked up immediately. There was also a porno video stuck in the VCR. A former girlfriend's sex toy was missing, left somewhere in her house. Not in her bedroom, I hoped. And inexplicably, a missing toothbrush. In a coke-fueled frenzy, I cleaned up the house, got in the car, and pulled up to the terminal as Granny was getting off the plane. I can only imagine how I looked. Bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, reeking of booze, plus I had a fat lip from being smacked by the beer bottle. Grandma hugged me, looked at me, and said, "What happened?" For once I told the truth, or at least most of it. I tearfully begged Grandma to forgive me. Then I called Jenny and asked her to do the same. The second time in 3 days. This was a grand performance, and of course, it was a lie. I had no intention of quitting and every intention of attempting suicide again. A few days off and I was back to my normal routine. It would go on and on, day after day, for another year.